Good day. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Limassol, Cyprus on April 7th, 2026, with our good friend Vijay Prashad. Vijay is a historian, editor, and journalist. He is a writing fellow and chief correspondent at Globetrotter, editor of Leftward Books, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, senior non-resident fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, at Renmin University of China, and has written more than 20 books, including The Darker Nations and The Poorer Nations. And my God, I don't know how this man has time to juggle all of these responsibilities. Thank you very much for joining us today, Vijay.
Why would I even cop to the term responsibilities? That's a very high bar you've set there. Yes, things, but maybe not responsibilities. Really nice to be with you. Yeah.
Thank you, Vijay. Vijay, I'd like to start by talking about a post that Donald Trump put out today. And in that post, he threatened to end Iranian civilization. I myself, Vijay, I imagine that Donald Trump understands that the U.S. doesn't have the ability to destroy Iran with conventional weapons in a single night. So I interpret that, to the extent that there's any rational interpretation that can be put on it, as a potential threat of a nuclear strike. In any case, I don't want to limit you to that angle of that question. What is your overall reaction to that post?
Well, firstly, Donald Trump is a nasty person. I mean, this is very clear from his public persona. I don't know what he's like personally, but his public persona is extraordinarily nasty, and also narrow-minded and ill-informed about the complexities of the world. That's what comes out of all these posts that he's been putting about the war in Iran. But really, when you read it carefully, there's a lot of bluster and so on, but there's also a real sign of weakness. The United States has not been able to win this conflict. At least it's not winning it politically, and certainly doesn't seem to be winning it militarily. What else is the US to do? How can it escalate? When you start by having domination strikes on a country, where you assassinate the supreme leader, where you kill a whole group of school children, these are domination strikes. That's what they started with in late February. After that, how do you escalate? I mean, where do you go? Whereas the Iranians first started with, run-of-the-mill missiles, then they went to their much faster missiles with a better range that had multiple warheads. They've held back their friendly forces in Iraq and so on. They haven't blown the whistle to let them go yet. They haven't used the several thousand small boats that they have in tunnels underneath the coastline. They have a lot of escalation still to go. They haven't escalated all the way. So in fact, Iran has many cards that it could play. Also, they have, I'm told, 7 or 8 layers of leadership that are ready and able to take over when the previous layer of leadership is killed. So decapitation strikes are not impacting them. They have a long way to go. They know that. They are not prepared to make a ceasefire for a ridiculous deal. They put a real deal on the table. And the United States, in that sense, is in a position of weakness, where the leader has to say, I'm going to wipe out the civilization. Frankly speaking, you can't wipe out Iranian civilization with a nuclear bomb either. You're going to have to, it's 100 million people across a very large terrain. You're going to have to use perhaps your entire nuclear arsenal. And then what's left? What's left? How is this going to impact Iraq? How will it impact Pakistan? How will it impact the whole region? Where's the wind going to blow? You think this is not going to have an impact on Qatar, on Kuwait, on all the Gulf Arab states? Ridiculous. I think this is just a sign of bravado. They're going to do another, sort of carpet bombing of Iran, which is what they've been doing. They're going to hope that they're going to be able to scare the Iranians into coming to a bad deal. They're not taking the Iranian proposal seriously. Iran has put a proposal on the table. It's a very good proposal, in my opinion. United States understands that if they accept the Iranian proposal, it's effectively a US surrender. And they don't have the wherewithal to accept that they have not won this war. So they are not going to accept that deal. They are going to continue to bombard and pummel the country. And he's going to continue to scream from his office this kind of genocidal nonsense, which they can't act upon. That's what I'm trying to say, that you can't actually wipe out the civilization, even with nuclear bombs. And they don't have anything beyond nuclear bombs. That's the best that they can do. You can't wipe out a civilization. Iran will return. The Iranian civilization has withstood the Mongols. It's withstood all kinds of ravages. It continues to come back.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about that proposal, one aspect of it. Of course, the Iranians have been quite clear that they want the United States to abandon its military bases in the Persian Gulf. One might argue that they've already largely done that. And certainly there must be some serious questions in the minds of the military leadership of the country whether those bases would be defensible if they were to be repopulated with soldiers and rebuilt. How realistic at this stage do you think this Iranian objective is, a final permanent withdrawal of U.S. military forces from the Persian Gulf?
Okay, so let's take this and the other proposal about stopping the war in the entire region, because I think these two things are, in a way, associated with each other. It's important to recognize that the first country after the Iranian Revolution that tossed out US military bases was not because of an Iranian demand. It was Saudi Arabia during the first Gulf War, that because of popular unrest in the country that said in the Dar al-Islam, in the land of Islam, there should not be a US military base. The United States had to actually remove their bases from Saudi Arabia. And that is when they expanded the bases in the Gulf Arab states, in the Emirates and so on. Saudi Arabia technically does not have a US military base because the Saudi government told them to remove them. Okay, so it's not an absolutely implausible demand. I doubt that the Qataris and the Emiratis and others are very excited to see giant US bases reconstructed and built on their land, although they also fear that they don't have any security right now against a possible attack from Iran. So they'd have to get some serious guarantees from Iran for this. It's not impossible for the US to have to remove its bases. I mean, it's not impossible that these countries would say, don't base here. But you see, what will the US do? Why did the US leave Iraq? It's a good question related to this. Because the Iraqi parliament said, you can stay in Iraq, but you can't get extraterritorial rights. In other words, your bases are not US territory. They will be Iraqi territory. That means Iraqi policemen can enter the base. And if your soldiers commit crimes on Iraqi soils, it is an Iraqi matter. They have to face trial in Iraqi courts based on the Iraqi constitution. United States government under President Barack Obama said nothing doing. Our soldiers will never face Iraqi law. Look at the situation in Japan. They don't face Japanese law. They run over children in the streets of Okinawa. They rape children in the streets of Okinawa. They're on the next plane back home. In Japan, you may be interested to know that US personnel are not even subject to Japanese immigration law. They just come in and out of the country. They don't show their passport to anybody. Yeah, it's the same. It used to be the same in Iraq. The Iraqis said, no, you're going to have to go through immigration. United States said that is not going to happen. They left. In fact, Qatar and the UAE and so on can just make those, claims. They don't even have to say no bases. All they need to say is you can come and rebuild, but this time you have to abide by Qatari law. You have to abide by Emirati law. No drinking on the base. Policemen must be allowed to enter and so on. And the US will have to think twice. Now, okay, so that's one demand, which I don't think is necessarily impossible, especially with the US facing all kinds of budgetary problems. Maybe they don't really need bases there. Yeah, maybe they're going to have to do war in a different way. It seems the aircraft carrier itself has got problems and might need to go and have some permanent reconstruction. As it is, the European frigate that the Germans spent already 2 billion euros on is stuck in the Danish yards because they have failed to be able to produce a boat. It's already billions, hundreds of millions over budget and so on. It's not going to be built. The ships need to be retooled. I mean, you can't just count ships, Dimitri. You got to look at the quality of the ship. You remember seeing the video of the toilets unusable on the ship. You better go fix all your stuff. But the other demand, that the war stop in Lebanon and that there be a peace agreement that is generally across the region, is very difficult because the United States will not be able to get Israel to the table on that. Will Israel agree? I don't think so. Israel believes that it can conquer the southern half of Lebanon, not just up to the Litani River, but perhaps up to the southern suburbs of Beirut. That's what they believe. They are well on their way to occupying the southern half of Beirut. They've bombed the whole area. There's 1 million refugees in Lebanon. 1 out of 5 Lebanese now are outside their homes. And Israel is not going to stop. The Iranians have said, we are not going to end this war unless there's a comprehensive peace agreement. That's going to be hard for the United States, I can tell you that. And then for the US to apologize for attacking Iran and then paying for the reconstruction of Iran, I don't think the US is going to agree to that, even notionally. Even if they hedge the language, saying, we will at some future point apologize, and at some future point we will discuss reparations payment for. I don't think it's going to happen. Yeah, and even if they say, Iran will pay reparations for damages in the Gulf Arab states and in Israel, if the United States, and then they just sort of cancel it out. They do an accounting and cancel it out. I don't think the US is going to even do it because it sets a terrible precedent for the United States. When the US goes and bombs Venezuela, they're not going to take responsibility and rebuild some medical facility that was bombed. Forget it. The US looks at those reasonable requests and say, not for us, for anybody else but us.
So, Vijay, that sounds like your assessment sounds like a prediction that we're heading for a global economic catastrophe because this war is going to escalate. As I've reported myself, it's not true that the Strait of Hormuz is completely closed. There is some traffic going through with the consent of the Iranians. But of course, it has been drastically reduced. And the longer that goes on, and the more degraded the energy infrastructure of the region becomes, the more the price of oil and gas is going to soar. So is that essentially what you're predicting is going to happen in the near term? We are going to see havoc economically on a global scale because of the ongoing conflict in the region?
I mean, it does not take a soothsayer. It does not take a soothsayer to have predicted that if the United States attacks Iran in the way that it did, that Iran would threaten something in the Strait of Hormuz. It's important to recognize in 1951, when Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, nationalized the oil of Iran from mainly European oil companies, the British threatened to close the Strait of Hormuz to prevent Iranian oil from leaving the area. Okay, it was not the Iranians. The first threat in modern times comes from the British. And then during the 1980s, when the United States and its allies pressed Saddam Hussein to attack Iran in 1980, in the war that lasted 8 years, in the middle of that war, Iranian and Iraqi vessels were firing at their mutual oil tankers. It was known as the tanker war. That almost closed the strait as a consequence of tankers basically being stuck there. That almost closed the strait. The strait has never been closed by the people who live around it. Never by the Omanis, the Iranians, the Gulf. Nobody has closed the strait. Even now, as you're saying, the strait has not been closed. It has been restricted and enormously restricted. 90% traffic down. That's the nearest thing you're going to get to closure. Yeah, it's the nearest thing you'll get to closure. Fertilizer prices are up because the moment natural gas prices go up, fertilizer prices go up. The moment oil prices go up, petroleum prices go up, food prices go up. Petroleum makes food prices go up immediately. That means that there's immediate problem in the market. Natural gas price puts fertilizer up, which means next year's food prices will be even higher. And the following year's food prices even higher. So this is going to be a multi-year problem already, not just now. Fertilizer futures are up and so on. And then because of the threat that the Iranians have placed on the role of the petroleum revenue and the dollar by saying if you use the yuan, you can use the Strait, there's very great hesitation among bond traders to be buying up US treasuries, which is going to put crisis. Yeah, it's going to create a crisis in the bond market in general, and specifically in the treasury market, in the notes, in the bonds and so on. It's going to create a big problem. And that could actually have a 10 to 20 year problem because there's no alternative currently to the US dollar as the major currency of trade. And if there's disruption of the dollar globally, I simply cannot tell you what's going to happen, because if faith in the dollar starts to collapse precipitously, I think it's actually a bad thing. It's like saying that I want to pull this house down in order to build a new house. But instead of gradually dismantling the house, you burn the whole thing down. Yeah? That's not great, man. You've got a whole mess there that you have to clean up before you can build a new house. What you want to ideally do is take down parts of it as you build, And that's exactly what's sort of happening, is that we are building local currency trades. We are building new mechanisms to reconcile trades. We're building new kinds of trust in international transactions. To precipitously get the dollar in trouble is actually not a great thing for the world economy. It's going to hurt a lot. Billions of poor people are going to be hurt terribly. But that's possible if this continues. Already bond traders are extremely hesitant. You can already see it. You see the sensitivity of the bond trader. They're already looking forward. Yeah, 90% of oil revenues are in dollars. The oil market is in dollars. Yeah, I'm not talking about trades. You can trade in different currencies, but the revenue is held in dollars. And that dollar gets recycled into the euro dollar market. I mean, it basically allows dollars to be outside the US, which are then used to buy treasury bonds and treasury notes and so on. That market is going to get really disrupted. And that, I'm not one of those people that, laughs when there's chaos, Dimitri. I worry about the immediate impact on billions of people who will face problem eating.
Yeah. I want to talk to you, Vijay, about how this economic turmoil is going to affect three key partners of the United States in Asia, and your assessment of how it's going to affect, in particular, their relations with the United States may be different from one state to the other. And I'd like to start with Japan. Japan imports, I understand, somewhere in the range of 90% of its oil from the Middle East. Interestingly, they've had me on two major Japanese networks for the first time in my life to talk about what I saw in the Strait of Hormuz, which is to me a sign of how deeply concerned they are in the country of what's going on there. They're just desperately trying to get any information they can about what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, this is a perilous situation for Japan. How do you think they're going to cope with this, and how do you think it's going to affect their relations with the United States?
So you're exactly correct. It's 90%, but it's also the liquefied natural gas that they get, which is a great threat because their fertilizer stocks are down to the question of weeks, not months. And that's going to be a serious problem for Japan year on year. They're going to have to find, and other countries are simply not selling natural gas or fertilizer. They're all hoarding it because nobody knows when it's coming out next. Yeah. So this is a serious problem. Japan has a far right-wing government. It's basically always been governed by the Liberal Democratic Party, the party right of center. This particular prime minister is a particularly far right version of the far right. She's very much close to the United States. Sees the security of Japan as rooted in U.S. power. The United States has about 100 military installations in Japan, many of them in Okinawa, not on mainland Japan, many of them in Okinawa, where there's an enormous debate and dispute about the permanence of these bases. So Japan is caught we're going to publish a text in a few months called East Asia's Double Bind. Japan is caught in a double bind. On the one side, it is completely dependent on Gulf Arab oil and natural gas, completely dependent. There's no other supplier for Japan. Japan tried to build in the northern islands a pipeline into a Russian oil field where they were collaborating with the Russians. But unfortunately for Japan, the war in Ukraine screwed up that collaboration. They were forced by the partnership they have with NATO and forced by their role in the G7 to basically slowly tiptoe out of that deal. They're still with it. They haven't walked away from the deal because it's, the field is just across the waters. They're building a pipeline. They don't want to walk away. It would help them a lot, but they have to for reasons of alliance to the US. You see how the double bind works. They are dependent on the gas and thing from the Gulf Arab states, trying to build a new relationship with Russia. All of these compromised by the ill thought out actions of their great partner, the United States. On the other side, they don't want to abandon their security shield with the US because they feel, for whatever reason, threatened by the people that they had previously conquered in Korea and in China. I mean, the Chinese and Koreans did not invade Japan. It was Japan that invaded them. Now, Japan claims to be scared of them. They have made no threats to Japan, no threats at all. But anyway, Japan has to pay the price now for this double bind. The real question Japan will have to deal with is this double bind unmovable? Or can Japan slowly walk out of this absolute bear hug with the United States, which they've had since the US occupation of Japan after 1945, the country that did drop 2 atom bombs on their territory? China did not. Korea did not. It was the US that dropped those atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Does Japan tiptoe out of that alliance and enter into a new understanding of its role in Asia? That's the only way it's going to be able to get Japanese flagged ships or ships carrying oil and natural gas to Japan through the straits now. And I will say even after the war ends, because whatever happens, Iran is going to control egress from the strait. And Japan is going to have to make a move one way or the other. This particular prime minister has no political space for that move unless she takes it on to be the Nixon of Japan and goes to China, as it were, and says, let's establish relations. And we will be happy to create a yuan yen bond from which we buy oil. We'll buy oil through a yuan yen bond a proposal and see if we can raise capital in the Japanese markets to underwrite buying of the petroleum and natural gas. I mean, that's, to my mind, if I was talking to a Japanese official, that's what I would propose. I would say the Prime Minister of Japan goes to China, has a public thing with Xi Jinping, makes an apology about the grotesque things that happened during World War II, and then come away with a yen yuan bond offering, which is basically a yen yuan, a petro yen yuan or something like that, and walk away with that. There's no other way out. But it means that she has to pivot from the far right to reason. To reason.
Right. Let's turn then to South Korea. South Korea, I don't have the figures in front of me. It too has a great dependence on oil from the Middle East, although I don't think it's as elevated as that of Japan. And in the case of South Korea, you have a couple of other factors at play, it seems to me. One is that the Americans apparently have been withdrawing air defense systems from South Korea and transferring them to West Asia, which must not be particularly reassuring to the South Korean government. And also, you had recently this episode where this character was going to implement martial law, the president of South Korea, I believe, and he ended up being prosecuted. And there was some question about whether the Americans had put him up to this. So, at the end of the day, how do you? This is a volatile mix politically and economically, I think. How do you think the government of South Korea is likely to react to sustained economic crisis occasioned by the war on Iran?
Well, firstly, you're absolutely right. South Korea it is, in fact, very dependent on Gulf Arab oil and natural gas, but not to the tune of 90% like Japan, only to the tune of 75%. But listen, 75% is a lot of dependency on one region of the world. In fact, 75% dependent on two choke points, the Straits of Hormuz and the Strait of Malacca. There are really only four choke points in the world if you leave out Gibraltar, from which no oil and natural gas goes, but it doesn't. It goes in but not out. It's basically Strait of Malacca, Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, and the Panama Canal are the main choke points, which would increase the price of gas and oil very high if they were closed. We saw that with the Ever Given ship blocking the Suez Canal a few years ago. South Korea, to the tune of 75% dependency, that's a fair amount. But like Japan, it's also in this double bind. On the one side, it is continually reliant on the United States for so-called security against the north of the country. Now, the question is, South Korea has gone back and forth on this. It's illegal to be a supporter of the policies of the North in South Korea. It's completely illegal. Nonetheless, occasionally you get a president in South Korea who has what was known as the sunshine policy. The president who attempted a coup d'etat, President Yoon, was actually prevented from that martial law act by mass uprising. I mean, it's interesting. South Korea is a very interesting place politically. It's not so easy to mark it. I mean, I've been to massive working class rallies where the truck drivers stop driving and park their cars on the freeway and sit down on little mats and listen to speeches and yell slogans. I mean, it's incredible. The power of the working class in South Korea is not to be underestimated. Well, the current president, President Lee, is slightly more center-left president, not center-left, maybe centrist president, then certainly far away from where President Yoon was, is a reasonable person. But again, the space for maneuver for a country like South Korea is so limited. I mean, both South Korea and Japan are basically still occupied by the United States ever since the war of 1945 ended. I mean, the enormous military bases in these countries, the presence of the U.S., the reliance on the U.S. To maintain good order in the country. The U.S. Embassy plays such an important role there. The embassy is right in the heart of the city and so on. It's like a government building, in fact. Actually, the U.S. Embassy in Seoul is like a government building, looks like a government building. And it's multi-story building. There's so many people there. It's incredible the impact it has on everyday life. The number of U.S. troops that circle in and out of there, it's in a double bind. You can't walk out of this military alliance easily because, there is a certain sense of insecurity about what this would mean from the North. A lot of people do want to see some unification, but they don't know how it's going to happen. They just have no idea what it would look like. They don't want the South to colonize the North necessarily. The North would not accept it. And the North to colonize the South, unacceptable to people in the South. So this is a really big problem for Korea. It's a double bind because they do need the oil and natural gas. The only other place they can get it is from Russia. But that will pose another challenge because the United States will not permit it at this time. Not if there's pipelines being built and so on. Anyway, these are two countries in our institute. The phrase we are using is East Asia's double bind, Japan and South Korea.
That brings us then to the very interesting case of India. I just want to remind people about the fact that the Prime Minister Modi went to Israel a day or two before this criminal war of aggression was launched, or relaunched, I should say, and accepted a medal from the Speaker of the Knesset, expressed a strong desire to see the bonds of the two countries deepened. And then there was this incident involving the Iranian naval vessel, which upon leaving Indian waters was promptly sunk by the U.S. Navy in one of the more heinous acts of treachery that we've seen in recent years by the United States military. In any case, I've also seen reports, I don't know what to make of them, that the Iranians have allowed some vessels transporting oil to India or intended for India as a destination to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So it's all to me a big jumble. I'm not sure what to make of it all. And of course, the last thing I want to point out, of course, is that they're both members of BRICS, Iran and India. So I really haven't been able to make sense of the relationship between Iran and India right now. What is your take on the relationship and where it's going and how India is going to react to this economic turmoil?
I mean, this is a very, very long story because, to properly tell you the story, and I'm just going to do it very briefly, one would have to go back centuries. I mean, India and Iran, especially northern India and Iran, are part of the same civilizational world. The language I grew up speaking, for instance, has much of its grammar and some of its vocabulary from Farsi, from Iran's language. The courts of northern India conducted their business in Farsi. It's like what French was in Europe. We look to the Safavid Empire for an understanding of statecraft. They were experts in building states. It's in fact Persian architecture that you see in the Mughal Empire in India. So when one looks at, let's say, the Taj Mahal is an amazing combination of Persian architecture and Indian architecture. It's remarkable. If you go to Isfahan, for instance, I don't know if you went to Isfahan this time, but if you go to Isfahan, so you would have seen some of the really beautiful architecture. You see the same kind of buildings in northern India, from a similar period. When Humayun returns from Iran, you see. So the relation between the two countries culturally is very old. The other thing is that India probably has the second or third largest Shia population in the world. Iran is the largest, and it's probably India or Pakistan. We go back and forth, second and third largest Shia population in the world. I grew up, for instance, in Calcutta. In the area where I grew up, there was a big Shia population. So Shiism is rooted in the Indian soil. It's part of Indian life. We're talking about very large numbers of millions of people, that are in India. So when Rafsanjani came to India some years ago, he addressed a mass meeting in Lucknow in northern India, a town which has one of the largest Shia populations in the country. So the relation of India with Iran is very complicated. It goes back to all these things. These are underwritten, Dimitri. You can't just, not say this is part of what is going on. Now, the other thing is that India is, of course, dependent on energy, enormously dependent on energy. And India buys a large amount of its energy from the Gulf Arab states and so on, and has a relationship with Iran. And right through the sanctions period, India was buying oil from Iran and paying Iran the oil in rupees. It was the oil for rupees deal. And Iran had a bank account in Calcutta, the city of my birth, in rupees, and would use the rupees to buy goods in India to get shipped to Iran. So this was a long relationship right through the sanctions period. India cannot afford not to buy natural gas and oil because with such a poor population, hundreds of millions of people in near poverty, even a right-wing government which is pro-Israel, which might even be pro-American in all respects, cannot afford to have mass starvation. That's not only electoral suicide, it's moral suicide. And so India has to continue to try to get discounted oil and natural gas, which is why when the United States tried to put pressure on India saying stop buying Russian oil, Indian refineries are very well tooled to deal with Russian quality crude. The US was saying stop buying Russian oil. The foreign minister has to say, sorry, you can't tell us where we can get our oil. We'll continue to buy oil. And India didn't stop buying Russian oil. Even recently, the prime minister made a comment to Trump. He said, maybe in future we won't. And Trump tweeted and said, Modi has said he's going to stop buying Russian oil. Yeah, in fact, that's not what Modi said to him. Modi said, maybe in future we, as a way to get off the point. In this case, right when the vessels were largely stopped, also Indian vessels, not just vessels carrying oil to India, but Indian vessels. And to be honest, not to be honest, but to be clear, there's a lot of Indian citizens who work in the merchant marines who are sitting in all kinds of flagged vessels inside the Gulf, unable to leave. So there's a lot of Indian citizens also trapped. It's not just ships going to India. So the Indian foreign minister opened a channel of communication with Tehran immediately and informed Tehran that India would like to continue to receive the natural gas and because there's an enormous crisis already in India. Natural gas is running out like crazy because it's the main form for cooking of food and for buses and so on. And the Iranians agreed to allow Indian oil to leave. So some Indian tankers have been able to move in and out. Egress has been permitted. So this is a special deal that they made. You can't understand this deal, Dimitri, if you try to understand Modi in Tel Aviv and Trump. No, this is a very old relationship. It's almost like you have an old neighbor, and you and the neighbor had a relationship 40 years ago. You knew each other when you were young, and then you sort of fell apart. And your kids only know you when you fell apart. But, sometimes you go to the fence and you say an interesting thing to each other, like, the blackbirds are back. And your neighbor said, yeah, it's great. And your kids are like, I can't believe you're talking to him. And, they don't understand that there was a time when you were the same people, right? And India and Iran is a little like that. It's very hard for countries that have such intimate cultures to diverge so fundamentally.
And is it your understanding, Vijay, that India continues to pay for the Iranian oil in rupees?
Well, this I don't know right now. It's very difficult to tell. Because of this whole yuan issue, I don't know what deal India has made, what Jaishankar has made with the Iranians. This has not been made public as far as I know. And I understand why it's not been made public. Because on the Indian side, you don't want it to be made public. If India has agreed to accept that they will have to pay in yuans, this is going to come off crazy for this government publicly. People are going to say, what? You succumb to this Iranian Chinese pressure or whatever? I don't think they want this debate. And so I think nobody is really interested in embarrassing anybody. So I think for sure they have not made it public. And I think for good reason. And if I was in charge, I would also not make it public. I would just say, well, we are getting the oil naturally. We worked it out with the Iranians.
So I'd like to conclude our conversation where I started, which is the relations of the countries in West Asia itself. And I want to focus finally on Saudi Arabia. We've seen conflicting reports about the Saudis' view about the war on Iran. There have been leaks to the press. The infamous Axios has been reporting that the Saudis are telling Donald to finish off those damned Iranians. But publicly, it doesn't seem like the Saudis are anxious to convey that impression themselves in their statements. What do you think the reality is of the Saudi autocracy's view of this war? Are they on the side of end this thing as quickly as possible? You've got to bring the hostilities to an end. Or is Axios right that they want to finish off the Islamic Republic once and for all?
See, if there wasn't active bombing happening in Iran, I would think that you're asking me an April Fool's question. Yeah, because there's something absurd about the question. It just seems like, Dimitri, this is ridiculous. Yesterday, I was going through a couple of the past issues of Al Arabiya, the Saudi mouthpiece newspaper. I was looking a few days because I was interested in a different issue, which is what was Mohammed bin Salman's public comments after Trump made the disparaging remark about it. I thought, let me check what Al Arabiya is saying. Well, there was really nothing there for understandable reasons. I mean, Trump says something ridiculous about you. You should not feel the need to come out there and contradict him because then you enter his gutter. I doubt that Mohammed bin Salman is going to feel obliged to come and make a comment. I mean, what does one say? So your question is an interesting one. And there's two ways to answer it. One is to say, well, I was talking to the Saudis and this is what they say to me, which I can tell you that I do not talk to the Saudis. I talk to lots of people in the region, but I don't really have very good contacts with the Saudis. So I don't know what's going on in the palace. Okay, just to be clear, that would be really interesting. And I'm sure some people have a good ear for the palace. I don't think it's Axios. I don't know where they're getting this stuff from. It always smells a little bit like Israeli intelligence to me. So I don't know what this is. And the intelligence agencies in that part of the world are so smart. They can play journalists like an out of tune fiddle into like a glorious orchestra. So, I mean, you have to be very careful what you're hearing. Now, if you just think theoretically, that's all I can give you because I don't speak to the Saudis. It looks like unless they are absolutely insane, they would realize that this is an impossibility. It seems to me that under the second period of Mohammed bin Salman's control of the country, when they opened the dialogue with Iran that was brokered by the Chinese, it seems at the time that the Saudis had come to the view that they were going to have to walk towards some sort of bargain with the Iranians, that this permanent tension and conflict was not benefiting either of them. So if that is the case, that only 2 years ago, the Saudi administration and the Iranians were willing to start a dialogue towards a bargain, it seems a little odd that the Saudis today would be saying something as stupid as finish them off. Firstly, the United States does not have to neighbor Iran. Okay, the United States is very far away. Saudi Arabia is a neighbor of Iran. Okay, there's the Gulf Arab states, but Saudi Arabia is a neighbor of Iran, and it's going to have to live right there. It's a little bit like Ukraine is a neighbor of Russia. They're going to have to live together. I've said this many times to myself. Zelensky doesn't understand that at the end of the day, he cannot lift Ukraine up and move it to the United States. He's going to have to live next to Russia. They're going to have to conduct some sort of deal, some arrangement. And it's the same with Saudi Arabia. This has been going on for too long, since 1979. Almost 50 years they've had this sort of war going on between them. They need to dial it down. I think Mohammed bin Salman has a view with Saudi 2030. I don't know if you've ever looked at that text produced by McKinsey for Mohammed bin Salman. It has a vision of making smart cities, new cities in Saudi Arabia, green economy, all this interesting stuff. Yeah. Some of it sounds science fiction-y, but what am I? I don't know enough about some of these engineering things. Go ahead and try it out. Use your sovereign wealth fund to build new cities, make more humane places for people to live and so on. Go ahead and do that. You can't do it if you're in a constant state of war with the Iranians. It's not possible. So you got to ease all this up. And so I find it personally, understanding this dynamic and theoretically, therefore, I find it inconceivable that anybody serious who has been part of the Saudi 2030 discussions and part of the discussions in China with the Iranians. Anybody serious who's been part of this is going to say, finish them off, because that's ridiculous. You've tried to finish them off since 1979. You have not succeeded. And the United States has not succeeded right now. So what finished them off? Are you going to allow the Israelis and the US to launch 5 nuclear bombs on the country? It's going to be devastating for Saudi Arabia. That's going to continue this war, and now to the death. Because you throw one nuclear weapon on Iran, it's to the death. If you look at Iranian intellectuals today, they are talking more and more about we are a country of martyrdom. 100 million people have to be killed before you're able to subdue the Iranians. Is Saudi Arabia willing to kill 100 million people? I don't think so.
I don't think so either, for what it's worth. Vijay, thank you so much. It's always fascinating and enlightening to talk to you, my brother. And stay safe over there in Chile. Hopefully, you won't be seeing too much social turmoil in the days ahead. But I don't have a lot of hope that we're going to see stability in the months that are coming. But anyways, pleasure talking to you, Vijay.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
And we're signing off today on April 7th, 2026.